Hi, I'm Amy Kaufman, and you're listening to Appraiser Talk, and this is our special series, USPAP Talk. We're walking through 100 plus USPAP topics one at a time. Welcome to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome back Timothy Hansen, Vice Chair of the Appraisal Standards Board, back to the show. Hi, Tim.
Thanks, Amy. Glad to be here.
Here's this week's question. When the ASB releases an exposure draft, what should appraisers actually do if they have thoughts about it?
The short answer is they should comment. Read the exposure draft, think about how it would work in practice, and send in a comment before the deadline.
That almost sounds too simple.
It is simple, but it matters. An exposure draft is the board saying, here's what we're considering. Tell us what you think before we make a final decision.
What makes a good comment?
Be clear and specific. Say whether you support the proposal, oppose it, or think it needs a change. Then say why. Real examples from practice are especially helpful because they show how the language might work outside of the meeting room.
So it doesn't have to sound like a legal brief.
No, not at all. Clear is much better than fancy. If a phrase is confusing, say that. If a proposal solves a problem, say that too. The board needs to understand what people in the field are seeing.
And do all of these comments really get read?
Yes, the board and the staff review the comments, look for themes, and consider the proposal, whether it should move forward, change, or be withdrawn.
So the takeaway is comment now.
Exactly. The exposure draft period is when the profession and the public have a chance to shape the language.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you so much for joining us today. Remember, USPAP is all about maintaining public trust, and this series is here to make it clear and practical for you. If you have comments or questions along the way, email me at amy@appraisalfoundation.org. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. Appraiser Talk is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This session is open to all interested parties, and we appreciate the time you are spending with us. Before we begin, there are a few quick housekeeping notes I will go over. We are recording this webinar, and you should see the recording post to our website and YouTube channel within a day. We will take questions at the end of the webinar as time permits. You can enter your comments in the chat box and your questions in the Q&A box. At the conclusion of the webinar, a very quick and brief survey will pop up, and we hope that you can take a moment to fill that out. Your feedback always helps us to continually improve our webinars. As many of you have seen, on Monday, June 22nd, the Appraiser Qualifications Board released our second exposure draft of the Real Property Appraiser Qualification Criteria. The purpose of today's session is to present what that draft proposes and explain how you may submit comments on it. For those less familiar with the term, an exposure draft is a set of proposed changes that the board publishes for public review. It is not final. It is issued specifically so that interested parties may review it and provide comment before the board makes any final decisions. This is the board's second exposure draft in this effort. The first was published, a full round of comment was received, and the board revised its proposals in response to those comments. The document before you today reflects that review. Over the course of this next hour, we will move through the proposed changes in turn, and we will set aside time at the end to explain the comment process in detail. We would ask you to keep one point in mind throughout. No proposal in this draft is final. The comment period is open, and the comments received will inform the board's final decisions. By way of introduction, I am Valerie Scott, the Vice Chair of the Appraisal Qualifications Board, and I am joined by our chair today, Jerry Urich, who has led this effort and will present alongside me today of the proposed changes. We will alternate through the presentation as we proceed. You are welcome to submit written questions during the session, and our team will address them where possible.
All right, well, thank you, Valerie, and thank you all for attending. The Appraisal Qualifications Board is responsible for the real property appraiser qualification criteria. That is, the requirements an individual must satisfy in education, experience, and examination to be qualified as a licensed or certified real property appraiser. Our second exposure draft proposes numerous changes to those criteria. And our task today is to set out each of those changes clearly, explain the reasoning behind them, and describe how you may comment. I will keep the focus on what the draft itself proposes. So on our next slide, you'll see our agenda. We will proceed in basically 3 parts. Part 1 provides a brief background on how the board arrived at this draft. And I'll keep that short, as it's just context for the proposals rather than the focus of our session today. Part 2 is the substance. It presents what the second exposure draft proposes, organized by theme, with the reasoning and the common support behind each change. The greater part of our time will be spent here. And part 3 addresses the comment period, how it operates, what makes a comment effective, and the deadline for submission. We regard this as equally important because the draft is shaped by the comments the board receives from you. If a proposal raises a question or a concern for you as we proceed, we encourage you to note it. At the close, we will explain how to enter that point into the formal record as a comment. So now let's move on to our next slide. So how the heck did we get here? Well, let me begin with a brief account of the work behind the draft, so the proposals that follow have some proper context for you. I'll move through this section efficiently. Its purpose really is to simply establish that the proposals rest on research and on the public record, not to dwell on the history of it. So let's talk about the reassessment project. This is the most extensive reassessment of the qualification criteria the board has undertaken since the criteria were first established in 1989. The board examined the requirements as a whole rather than in isolated pieces, meaning nothing was left off the table. I do want to emphasize one point because it is the foundation of everything that follows. This effort did not begin with the board's preferences. It began with a national job analysis, a structured study of the work that real property appraisers actually perform. The intent was for us, really for the intent I'd say which should be that it's really focusing on the requirements that follow the work appraisers do. The draft rests on 4 sources. As I mentioned, the 2025 National Job Analysis conducted by PSI Services, a structured decision framework applied consistently to each issue, a review of the board's statutory obligations, and a broad record of public input. The job analysis is significant because it anchors the requirements in current practice rather than long-standing assumptions. It allows the board to ask for each requirement whether it genuinely relates to readiness to perform the work or whether it has simply been carried forward over time. The board's objective throughout can be stated in a single sentence: to broaden entry into the profession without lowering the qualification standard. Those 2 aims must be held together, and that balance is the consistent theme of this exposure draft. In practice, that's meant removing requirements that do not influence or have an effect on readiness, preserving the rigor of the standard, so a credential continues to carry meaning, and improving the clarity of the criteria for those who must apply them. So now let's talk about the project timeline. To convey the scale of this enormous amount of work, there were over approximately 18 months the board had produced and published several hundred pages of research, analysis, and supporting material. And the sequence is pretty straightforward. It began again, as I said, the National Job Analysis. It proceeded to the first exposure draft and the accompanying concept papers, then to the research brief that you probably saw, and now to this second exposure draft. with the comment period open through July 27th, 2026. Each stage was built upon the one before it. The job analysis informed the first draft, the comments on that draft, and on the concept papers informed this draft. The document you see before you is the result of that natural progression. The board took public comments at more than one point along the way and revised its proposals in response. Several of the changes in this draft exist because comments identified a concern, like comments that you provided, and the board agreed. The point I would ask you to take from this is that the work has been deliberate and grounded in evidence. Each proposal is supported by research, by the National Job Analysis, and by the comment record. And that process really continues now. This draft is not the board's final word. It remains subject to revision based on the comments received in this round, which is the reason for today's session and the reason you get to comment. So on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about what the first exposure draft proposed. Again, because much of today is really focused on what changed between the first draft and this one, let me briefly recall what the first exposure draft proposed. It was the board's initial position, and we published that back in 2025. It proposed removing the college degree requirement at the certified levels. It also proposed adding an applied analytics course while removing the open elective block. It also proposed allowing greater flexibility in the timing of experience, reducing the certified residential experience period, defining the practicum more fully, and removing continuing education for trainees. Now, most of those proposals carried forward into this second exposure draft, and they've been refined rather than revised or reversed. Those who follow the first draft will recognize a substantial portion of what follows. It was a sound initial direction, and the comment record indicated that further work was warranted. The comments supported the direction while identifying matters that required additional development by the board. One thing was raised more consistently than any other: access. The concern that qualified individuals are being prevented from entering our profession. That theme is the principal reason for the two most significant items you will see in part 2 of today's presentation: a new pathway into the profession and an expansion of flexibility within the existing pathways. So on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the two concept papers that we issued for comment. So alongside with that first exposure draft, you might recall that the board issued those two really great concept papers, and that they really focused on the ideas around the feedback that we received from you all and also what was published rather than considering feedback. So the first concept was really focused on a skills-based pathway. The concept and the question was really whether readiness could be demonstrated through evaluated work product rather than solely through the accumulation of supervised hours. The second concept was an examination-only pathway. The question was whether a single comprehensive examination could qualify a candidate without the traditional experience component. The board chose concept papers deliberately. The demand for an additional route into the profession was considerable, but the board did not yet have an approach it was prepared to recommend. Rather than propose prematurely, the board set out the ideas and requested input. And the response was really substantial. And it directly shaped the new pathway presented what you'll see in part 2 of our presentation, the second exposure draft. The concept papers served really a genuine purpose in the development of this draft. So speaking of the comment record, the level of engagement was again significant. The board received over 580 comment letters containing several hundred distinct arguments across the documents that were issued for comment. And the participation was broad. Comments were received from state regulators, from practicing appraisers across the classifications, from educators and course providers, from the lending community, and from advisory councils, among others. Each of those comments was reviewed and weighed before this draft was prepared. The board treats the comment process as a substantive part of its work. I want to clarify one point because it's often misunderstood. Comments are not a vote. The board does not simply count the letters on each side. It weighs the quality of the reasoning and the strength of the evidence presented. And that's consequential because a single, well-reasoned comment that identifies a genuine problem can change the draft, regardless of how many others raised it. You will see a specific instance of this later in the presentation. So now, I'd like to speak a little bit about how the board reached this draft. And I'll be brief here, but I want you to understand the manner in which these decisions were made. The board worked through each issue using the same consistent, evidence-based approach rather than responding to whichever argument was most forcefully expressed. Each decision was grounded in the same sources: the job analysis, which establishes what work requires, the supporting research, and the comment record, which indicates where the profession identifies difficulty. Each proposal was required to satisfy two tests: that it's supported by the evidence and that it falls within the board's authority. A proposal that did not meet both tests was not included. In short, the process supported the board's judgment. It did not substitute for it. The board still exercised judgment on difficult questions, but did so with a disciplined and consistent framework.
Thank you, Jerry.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Jerry, for that background. Now what everyone is here for today, to discover what the second exposure draft proposes. We will now turn to the substance of what is in this second exposure draft, which is where the majority of our time today will be spent. This is the most important section of today's session. If a proposal affects your work that is in the second exposure draft or prompts a view, we encourage you to make a note of it now, as those notes will assist you when you prepare your comments.
All right, thank you, Valerie. So let's jump into the second exposure draft and look at this as a whole. Before turning to the individual changes that we'll talk about, let me give you the overall shape of this draft, because the detail is easier to follow with this structure in mind. At the highest level, the draft does 4 things, and nearly every specific change falls within one of them. First, it opens up additional pathways. This includes a new route to the credential and additional means of combining the pathways that already exist. Second, it removes requirements that do not influence or have an effect on readiness. This is where the degree mandate, the open elective block, the fixed calendar minimums are really removed. Third, it adds flexibility. This appears in the timing of the examination, in the period for which a passing score remains valid, and in relief for qualifying hardship circumstances. And fourth, it improves clarity. This is plain language drafting, standardized definitions, and a reorganized structure, so the document is more usable for those who rely on it. I would ask one thing as we go through the details. Consider these proposals against the criteria currently in effect, not only against the first exposure draft. If you measure it that way, you will see the full extent of the proposed changes. So taken together, if we consider this as a whole, the combined effect of these proposals are really straightforward. A larger number of qualified individuals would be able to enter the profession, and the route to a credential would be more direct. Let me be specific about whom these changes are intended to serve. They're directed at capable individuals, those who are ready, or who can readily become ready, but who are presently held back by requirements that do not measure readiness. At the same time, the draft is designed to preserve what a credential signifies. And that's the assurance that the individual holding it is, at a minimum, qualified to perform the work. The board has treated that assurance as a fixed constraint. I would therefore caution against viewing access and the standard as opposed. This exposure draft was constructed to advance both, and a considerable part of the work was ensuring that access was not achieved at the expense of the standard. So now we're going to go through and summarize a few of the proposed changes. I'll set out the structure for the remainder of this section, and the specific changes really fall into 4 themes, which I will take in order. The first theme is new and expanded pathways. This includes the principal item, a new demonstration appraisal report pathway, together with additional means of combining experience across programs. The second theme is education directed at readiness. The degree mandate is removed, and a new market data analytics module is added to address an identified skill gap. The third theme is experience. I will preview the central point now because it is one of the most often misread. The required hours do not change. What changes is the calendar minimums surrounding them. The fourth theme is the clarity and administration. Plainer language and standardized definitions which do not alter the standard, but make the criteria easier to apply. I will take each theme in turn with the reasoning and the comment support behind it. So now we'll compare the current criteria to the second exposure draft. Now, if you retain a single impression from this comparison, which is a great one, and I really like this slide, let it be this. When the current criteria are set against this exposure draft, what you principally see is removals and added flexibility with one new course and one new pathway. Yes, there's over 159 pages in this exposure draft, but guess what? These are the principal changes. So if you boil it down, these are huge. So I'll start with the central point directly. Nothing in this draft raises the standard required to qualify. There is no new hurdle. The movement is toward removing requirements that do not influence or have an effect on readiness. Where the exposure draft adds, it does so narrowly and deliberately. The analytics module and the demonstration pathway are the only substantive additions, and each respond to a need identified in the comment record. I would ask you to keep that frame as we proceed through the details. Most of what follows is the removal of requirements, with 2 targeted, evidence-based additions where the record identified a genuine gap. So let's talk about that new demonstration appraisal report pathway. This is the principal proposal in the exposure draft, so I will treat it carefully. The board proposes a new means of qualifying, under which a candidate completes 3 reviewed USPAP compliant appraisal reports on real properties through a board-approved entity. Its origin is relevant. It developed from the examination-only concept that was issued for comment. The board retained the objective that concept was reaching for, a route that does not depend on securing a traditional supervisor, but achieved it through the production of reviewed work rather than through a single examination. And the distinction is very important. Under an examination-only module, readiness would be demonstrated by passing a test. Under this pathway, readiness is demonstrated by producing actual appraisal work that is then reviewed against the standard. That's the reason the board is prepared to put this forward. It verifies the same underlying readiness that the traditional experience routes verify. The candidate must still demonstrate the ability to produce competent, compliant appraisals. So let me set out the specific requirements, because the rigor of the pathway lies in its mechanics. So on our next slide, you'll see that the requirements are as follows. The candidate completes 3 reviewed appraisal reports, and at least one of those 3 must be a complex assignment. That requirement is deliberate, so that the pathway addresses more than the routine work. The assignments are administered within an approved structure. The board-approved entity sets the assignments and the review standard. And they do that in a manner that parallels the approval of PREA, or Practical Applications in Real Estate Appraisal program. There is an accountable, approved program behind the pathway. Upon successful completion, the pathway satisfies the licensed residential experience requirement in full. It is a complete and recognized means of meeting that requirement. And the governing principle here is equivalence. The pathway verifies the same work that the other pathways verify. What it removes is the requirement to accumulate those hours under a traditional supervisor. I will address the question of rigor directly. This is not a reduced standard. Each report is reviewed against a defined standard by an approved entity, and the completion of 3 reviewed reports, including a complex assignment, is a demanding demonstration of readiness. The significance of the pathway lies in whom it reaches, which Valerie will now discuss.
Thank you, Jerry. Let's look at what some of the comments record that we received over this proposed pathway. Because the demand for an additional pathway was amongst the strongest signals the board had received, it was expressed directly and from a range of sources. Several of those comments that you all can see on the screen are shown by different entities. They are attributed by type of stakeholder only, not by the exact names. You will see a reference to the difficulty in rural and underserved markets and direct requests that an additional route be provided. We have also included a comment urging caution from a party who considered the existing changes sufficient and an additional pathway unnecessary. That inclusion is deliberate. The board heard both positions and both are represented on the screen. What the board did was provide the pathway while incorporating safeguards into it, rather than leaving it open-ended. It sought to respond to the demand and to address the legitimate concern at the same time. The safeguards are specific. The pathway is limited to the licensed residential classification, and each report is reviewed against a defined standard. Those constraints are what allow the board to extend this route responsibly. On the next slide, we will discuss who the new pathway reaches. Let me describe whom it will intend to reach. The assessment and mass appraisal professions who perform valuation work but do not fit the traditional training model, appraisers in confidential settings, such as federal agencies, where conventional supervision does not apply, candidates with related valuation experience, and capable individuals who are unable to secure a supervisor. I would underscore that final group because it represents the central difficulty. The unavailability of a supervisor is among the most common reasons that qualified individuals do not enter the profession. The pathway is designed specifically to address that obstacle. As to why it is limited to the licensed residential classification, the narrowest scope, this reflects a deliberate, measured approach. The board is introducing the pathway where the consequences are most contained so that it can be observed in practice. It is properly understood as a careful first step. The board can observe how candidates who qualify through this pathway perform, gather evidence, and assess the results before any consideration of a broader application. I want to be clear on that point. This is a first step, not a commitment to extend the pathway. Whether it is ever applied beyond the licensed residential classification will depend on its performance and on the evidence gathered. If you have views on what should be required before any such extension, that is a valuable subject for comments. Next, we will talk about removing the college degree requirement. I want to begin with the change that received more support than any other in the comment records. The board proposes to remove the college degree requirement for the certified residential and certified general classifications. I would note the strength of that support. This was the single most frequently requested change across the comments received. The proposal responds directly to what was requested. The reasoning expressed in the comments was consistent. A college degree frequently in an unrelated field does not in itself prepare an individual to perform a competent appraisal. Commenters questioned why readiness should depend on a credential that may bear no relation to valuation experience. I would be clear about what is not changing. The qualifying education hours remain. The required appraisal coursework remains, and the examinations continue to verify the necessary skills. The board proposes to remove the general degree mandate, not the appraisal-specific education. The board has also paired this removal with a new market analytics module that addresses the specific skill a degree served only as an indirect proxy for. The gap is addressed deliberately, and I will present that in the next slide. What did the commenters say about the college degree? Support for removing the degree mandate was very strong, and several of those comments appear on the screen. The language is direct, calling for the requirement to be eliminated and observing that an unrelated degree does not prepare a candidate for appraisal practice. We have again included a comment on the other side from a party who did not support the removal. The board considered that view rather than setting it aside, and we presented it here for the same reason. The board's response to that concern is as follows. The analytical and reasoning skills that a general education is intended to develop are verified in this profession through the required curriculum and examination, not through a degree in an unrelated subject. The element that addresses the current concern most directly is the new market data analytics module presented on the next slide. This is the one new element of required qualifying education in the draft. It is added to required core curriculum, so it is a requirement for every candidate at these classifications, not an elective. The hours are specified, 15 hours for the certified residential classification and 30 hours for the certified general classification, scaled to the level of the credential. Its context is the extraction, application, and reconciliation of market data. Stated plainly, it concerns the use of market information to arrive at a supportable value conclusion, which is central to our appraisal practice. The basis for adding it is specific. This is the skill that the 2025 job analysis identified as a gap, an area in which the data indicated candidates required more direct preparation. The addition is a targeted response to that finding. It also connects directly to the degree decision. A general degree was only an indirect proxy for analytical ability. This module teaches the relevant analytical ability directly, which is a more precise means of addressing the need. Accordingly, the removal of the degree does not reduce the analytical demands of the profession. This module directs those demands to where the work requires them. On the next slide, let me present the net effect on education. When the requirements are compared before and after, the total required education hours are essentially unchanged. The amount of education has not been reduced. What has changed is the composition of those hours. The general degree mandate is removed, and the hours are directed towards core, practice-ready content. The accurate description is a redirection of education towards readiness, not a reduction of it. The quantity is maintained, its focus has just been improved. It is the same pattern present throughout the draft. A requirement that did not influence or have an impact on readiness is removed, and the substance that does bear on readiness is retained and, in this case, sharpened. Jerry, over to you.
Thank you, Valerie. So let's talk a little bit about experience requirements. I'll lead with a point of greatest importance because it's the one most frequently misunderstood. The required experience hours do not change. They remain 1,000 hours for licensed residential, 1,500 hours for certified residential, and 3,000 hours for certified general. I will restate it because it is often misread. The experience requirement itself does not move. The board is not reducing the amount of experience an appraiser must obtain. What our proposal draft says is that we are suggesting changes in the calendar associated with those hours. The current criteria impose fixed minimum periods, measured in months, that a candidate must wait. The draft removes those calendar minimums. And the reasoning is as follows. What verifies readiness is the experience itself, the hours of appraisal work, not the number of months over which that work was spread. Requiring a capable candidate to wait a fixed period of months after the work has been completed does not advance the protection of the public. There's also a practical effect. Removing the calendar minimum reduces the duration of the commitment required of a supervisor. And a supervisor availability is itself, again, as you know, a significant constraint, within the system. The summary is therefore precise. The requirement is retained, the hours are retained, and what is removed is the fixed calendar period surrounding them. So let's talk about additional flexibility in earning experience on the next slide. In addition to removing the calendar minimums, the draft proposes additional means of earning the same required experience. So the candidates are not confined to a single track. There are actually three. First, candidates may combine pathways, applying logged hours, PREA, and the practicum toward a single total. The principle is that verified progress should not be forfeited. Work that has been verified in one program should count toward the total. Second, the draft permits partial PREA credit. PREA programs may be approved in segments so that a candidate earns and retains partial experience credit for the portion completed rather than facing an all or nothing result. Third, a PREA route is added at the certified general classification, where previously only logged hours and the practicum were available. This provides a structured option at the highest classification level. Two protections remain constant throughout. The total experience requirement does not change, and the same work cannot be counted twice. The exposure draft adds routes. It does not discount the requirement. So the purpose of these provisions is to allow candidates to satisfy the experience requirement in a manner consistent with their own circumstances, rather than through a single uniform path. Valerie, back over to you.
Continuing with appraisal experience, we have a narrower change regarding verification of mass appraisal experience. I present this as a clear illustration of the comment process. It concerns the verification of the mass appraisal experience. The difficulty was as follows. The first draft required the signature of a chief assessing officer to verify that experience. Commenters observed that in many jurisdictions, the chief assessing officer is not a credentialed appraiser, and in some jurisdictions, the position is actually elected. The required signature, therefore, did not reliably verify the experience. In response to the draft, in response to that, this exposure draft removes that requirement. No individual signature is required. Verification instead rests on the assessment office's statutory USPAP framework and on the state's agency's own verification methods, which are more reliable indicators than a single signature. I present this change deliberately, narrow as it is, because it is a clear instance of a comment changing the draft. A party identified a specific deficiency, set out the reasoning to the board, and the board amended the provision. That is precisely the process we are inviting you to take part in. On the next slide, we'll talk about examination timing and validity. These are two changes presented here, both concerning the examination and both concerning flexibility rather than difficulty. I'll talk about the timing first. On timing, the draft permits the examination to be taken before or after experience, rather than only after the experience, as the current criteria requires. There is a reason to align it with the completion of education in particular. Taking the examination upon completing qualifying education aligns the examination with the material the candidate has just studied. It is comparable to the practice in other professions in which the licensing examination follows the completion of education. For validity, the current criteria provide that a passing result expires after 24 months. The draft provides that a passing result is valid indefinitely. The reasoning for this is as follows. A passing score is a record of knowledge the candidate demonstrated, and that record does not expire. Currently in practice, it is maintained through experience, continuing education, and USPAP. A fixed expiration on a score already earned did not serve a clear purpose. So let's look at what the commenters said about the examination. On the examination, the comment record was very consistent. Commenters supported aligning the examination with education, and several of those comments appear on your screen. The comparison most frequently drawn was to other licensing examinations that follow the completion of education, with the examination taken while the material is current. Another comment framed it in terms of sequence, that the natural order is education, then examination, then the credential, with experience arranged flexibly around it. The board found that reasoning persuasive and agreed. The draft accordingly aligns the examination so that it may follow the education it is designed to measure. Jerry, back to you.
Thank you, Valerie. Now let's talk a little bit about the clarifications and administrative improvements that we're thinking about in this draft. The final group of changes is less prominent than the new pathway we just disclosed, but it's equally consequential because these changes make the criteria materially easier to apply. The draft provides a plain language drafting of the supervisory provisions and other sections. Clearer requirements are applied more consistently by those who rely on them. The draft standardizes the definition of transaction value so that it conforms to the definition used in federal regulation. This is a definitional alignment that removes an inconsistency within the criteria. The exposure draft also consolidates the reciprocity provisions and adds new continuing education reciprocity, which reduces friction for appraisers credentialed in more than one state. The exposure draft also provides relief for qualifying circumstances, such as serious illness, military deployment, and natural disasters, so that such events don't unfairly impede a candidate. The exposure draft also recognizes the document to improve usability. None of these changes alter the standard to qualify. They reduce confusion and make the criteria easier to administer. So,
thank you, Jerry. Now, what you all are here for today, after you've read the full second exposure draft, the comment period is open. This concludes our overview of the proposals. We will now turn the greatest matter to those on how to provide comments to us. I would frame it precisely. This remains a draft, not a final rule, and the comments received are the means by which it will be refined or can be refined. Each of the proposals we have reviewed is open to your input, and the next portion of the session explains how to provide those comments effectively. What does the adoption and effective dates look like? Let me address this timing and adoption directly, while noting that precise dates cannot yet be provided. The board has worked with counsel on the available options. For context, where prior changes increased requirements, effective dates were frequently set 2 or more years out to allow time to adjust to a higher requirement. The present situation may differ. A substantial number of these changes are reductions or clarifications rather than additional requirements, and the considerations that ordinarily call for an extended period do not all apply in the same way. The board is considering what that means for timing. The accurate answer is that precise effective dates depend on what the board ultimately adopts following this comment period. The board will not set a date that its final decisions may not support. Certain elements will require lead time. A new course must be developed and approved, and the new pathway requires an approval framework before it can be used. Those steps cannot be completed immediately. Other elements Principally, the removals and clarifications may take effect sooner. The logistics remain under consideration, and the board prefers to be precise rather than to provide a date it may have to revise at a later time. How can your comments be effective? Let me offer some practical guidance on submission of comments that have an effect, because there's a meaningful difference between a comment the board can act upon and one that it cannot. First, be specific. The most useful comments identify the precise section and the precise language at issue. The clearer the reference, the more directly the board can respond to it. Second, provide your reasoning. As Jerry noted or earlier, the board weighs the reasoning and the evidence behind a certain position, not the position alone. A comment that explains its basis carries considerably more weight. Third, where you believe a provision is in error, propose a remedy. Identify the language or the alternative you would prefer. A concrete proposed revision is far easier for the board to adopt. I would add one more point. A comment need not be formal or polished to be considered. A comment in any format of any length is welcome and is reviewed. You need not be a subject matter expert or an attorney to be heard. If a provision matters to you, your perspective has value, and the board wants to receive it. On the next slide are our key messages. As we conclude, let me leave you with several points to carry forward. The first is the central principle of the draft. It broadens entry while preserving the standard. Additional means of qualifying directed at capable candidates with the same underlying readiness verified through additional means. The second concerns the basis for the draft. It rests on evidence, a national job analysis, a research brief, and several hundred comment letters addressed through one consistent process. The third is the most important at this stage. This is a draft. Your written comments are the means by which your input enters the formal record and informs the final results. Your input is consequential. A considered comment is the means by which your perspective is reflected in what follows. We want to hear from you. As the next slide will indicate, here's what you need to do in order to act. The comment period is open now and runs through July 27th, 2026. We encourage you to note that date and get your comments turned in. Comments need to be submitted in writing through the Foundation's website at appraisalfoundation.org. I would reiterate how comments are handled. Every substantive comment enters the official record and is weighed individually. It becomes part of what the board is required to consider. One final request: if you are aware of colleagues who should provide comments, we would ask that you share this information with them. A fuller record produces a better final result. Jerry, over to you for some Q&A now.
Super. Thank you very much, Valerie. Now that we have some time left, we want to hear from you. If you have any questions or comments, now's your chance. Please enter your comments into the chat box and your questions into the Q&A box. If you have a verbal comment, please raise your digital hand and we will recognize you. Don't forget to unmute and tell us your name and an organization that you may be representing. So, Aida has hopped onto the screen there, so welcome. And Aida, any questions or comments or raised hands that we need to address?
Thank you. We actually have had many questions and we have been handling them through the chat and also the Q&A box. But here are some themes and topics, Jerry, that I can just kind of go some education and degree requirement questions. So one was, what was the AQB's rationale for proposing the removal of the bachelor degree for the certified general appraiser? How did the board assess the potential impacts on the profession, public confidence, and especially with the rise of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, great question. And actually, we have attempted to respond to that in the actual exposure draft, in the rationale under the appendix for the back end of the exposure draft itself, and talking about the removal of the college degree, as well as the responses that we gave in the first exposure draft. But basically, it's this. if you think about a college degree, let's say you have a college degree in real estate, and many of the courses that you've taken align very well with the required core curriculum that we have. Super. That means that you are much farther along than if you have a degree in an unrelated field that has nothing to do with real estate. So if you have to go through and get education, it's about, well, are you aligning with the required core curriculum, or are you, do you have a degree in something else? And some of the things we've also heard is, well, gosh, if you don't have a real estate degree, it's really not a profession, it's a trade. Not true. This is a profession because of the fact of the amount of rigor that we have in terms of the examination, education, and experience that we have. It's not something that you would expect, is a tradesman type process. This profession does have required core curriculum, and that required core curriculum is something that we recognize that, hey, if you've got this, do you really need a degree on top of that in an unrelated field? And obviously the data and the analytics that we have, and the evidence that we have shows that it's not relevant to, making sure that someone is successful in our profession. So certainly I don't discount a degree. I think it's a great thing if you want one. But do you need to have one to, as we're proposing? Not in this exposure draft or the previous exposure draft. And again, I think that's something that we talked about earlier in our session, is that, we heard that comment and that theme throughout. It was something that really would even adversely impact those that might be, otherwise capable and ready to move up within the credentialing. Say, for example, you're a certified residential appraiser, and the only thing stopping you from becoming a certified general is that degree. You've got the experience. You've been, working with maybe a certified general, and you've been, assisting and producing, complex or cert res type of assignments, but you don't have the degree, so you're kind of stuck. This opens up that pathway for you, so that you're not artificially just being held back because you've got the education, you have the experience already. The education meaning the required core curriculum. You have the experience. Why not be able to sit for that exam if you're ready for it? So again, I can go on, but I'll stop there for bro. And Valerie, anything else you would add?
No, I think that covers that question, Jerry. I think there's some more, so we can probably move on to another one.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jerry. And actually, we have some couple of comments applauding the board for removing that requirement for some of the upgrading of the licenses. Moving on to the market data analytics course. The question is, so if this new course, market data analytics, is intended to replace the analytical skills traditionally associated with a college degree, why is this course required for applicants who already have a bachelor degree?
Valerie, you want to try that one?
Sure, I've got that. So since the proposal is to remove a college degree, going forward, a degree wouldn't be required. So this is a gap in knowledge that our job analysis identified is the market analytics. And so for even those that could have come in already having a degree, since the degree was not a specific topic area, you could have a teacher degree and never had taken any analytics or data, or have a degree in something totally unrelated to any sort of analysis or statistics that anyone ever had. So this was a knowledge gap identified from our job analysis that needs to be in place for everyone. We can't assume that some have had this class, even if they did already previously have a college degree.
Thank you. I'm going to shift a little bit more to the trainee requirements, Jerry and Valerie. We had a couple of questions just to see like how it's changing from the current criteria. What's the required education for a trainee, and also the continued education? So one question is, for states that issue trainee appraiser credential and require periodic renewals, can a trainee renew without completing any continuing education under the proposed criteria? If so, would there also be no recurring USPAP education requirement for that trainees?
Yeah, great question. So as we've proposed in this exposure draft and the previous exposure draft, we recognize that a trainee is working underneath a supervisor. And so since they're working underneath a supervisor and receiving constant feedback from that supervisor and working through gaining their experience. And in some cases, they might even still be working on their qualifying education in some situations. So, the requirement for them to also have additional continuing education seems onerous. We've heard that comment from a number of folks that are really, this area is really important to them. And really, if you think about it, since they have that trainee supervision, do they really need to keep going through CE while they're in some cases getting QE? The board, through our analytical process, determined that it wasn't necessary for a trainee to go through and get CE because of what I've just said. It doesn't mean that a trainee is forbidden from getting CE. It's just simply that, okay, well, you're still in a trainee mode. Do you need the CE? It doesn't mean they can't take additional USPAP courses or anything like that. It's just something that we're saying at this point, your trainee stay within that lane, so to speak. And once you're credentialed, obviously all the CE requirements with a credential apply. Does it mean that a state will adopt this? Again, states, as you know, are free to adopt more stringent requirements than what's in the criteria. So there are some states that might still say, for us, we want our trainees to have CE, or we want them to have something additional beyond what the AQB standard. So that's states' rights, and that's certainly fine. But again, we're pointing out that we're setting the minimum qualification criteria, and the minimum qualification criteria is no additional CE while you're in a trainee mode. Anything to add there, Valerie?
No, not. I think you've covered it.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think you covered the second question, Jerry, there, so that's perfect. We've covered that topic, and I'm going to move on to the demonstration report pathway. So there's a lot of great engagements in the chatbot and the Q&A. I think everybody's just really, really curious about this pathway. So has the AQB considered the ASB's I'm sorry. Let me go back to the first question. Could the demonstration appraisal pathway eventually be structured with a milestone or a segment type of credit? For example, allowing 1 or 2 completed reports to earn partial experience credits similar to the proposed PREA program segments?
Yeah, at this point, that's not how we're proposing it. And the rationale is because this is its own pathway. Since it's its own pathway, if a candidate chooses this pathway, they go down this path and produce 3 USPAP compliant appraisal reports, one of those being complex. And then those are, again, reviewed and graded by an approved AQB approved entity. So it's, that pathway doesn't, flip over and say, okay, well, let's combine, part of what I've done in trainee or part of what I've done in practicum or PREA, and let me add that to this. So maybe I only have to have 1 demonstration report. At this point, that's not what's intended there. Again, this is intended for, again, as I mentioned before, very capable individuals who, for example, let's say somebody that's in the international evaluation space, somebody comes over from another country, has a credential from another country in evaluation, and really is in many ways kind of forced to go through and get go through the experience process that's that we currently have in the criteria. But this gives them the opportunity to say, okay, you've got you allegedly you have the experience and the education and everything else. So then why not show it to us with these 3 demonstration reports to show that, yeah, you can do this. You can actually produce competent USPAP compliant appraisal reports. That's a great way for those individuals to get into that. In addition to folks such as your some of your mass appraiser folks that otherwise might not have the opportunity to do this as well. So and I think there's another way that always comes to mind, which is, if you are let's say, and I've heard this from others say, gosh, I'm a real estate broker. I've been in this profession, in the real estate profession for 30 years. I can appraise better than most appraisers I know. Okay, well, great. If you've got the education and you have taken passing the exam, great. How about 3 demonstration reports to show us that you can actually do this work? So we're trying to open this up so that people in different pathways, or different avenues of you can't find a supervisor. We hear that so often. Those individuals now have a pathway into this profession at the licensed residential. So.
Thank you, Jerry. We have a
Yeah.
couple more minutes. We have 2 more minutes, so maybe 1 or 2 questions. I'm going to switch to the new course. If the proposed changes are adopted, will the AQB publish a detailed course specifications or a learning objective for the new market data analytics module so providers can develop course for approval?
Val, you want to answer that one?
Yes. There will definitely be an outline of what those gaps were. As our job analysis indicated, we will be providing direction for sure to course providers of what that knowledge gap is that is needed out in the industry.
Okay. Another one is similarly, will the AQB publish a detailed specification for the proposed Certified General PREA program to assist providers in developing an AQB approval program?
Super great question. That's actually being worked on right now. Obviously we proposed this, and so if we propose it and then everybody likes it, guess what? We have to make sure we have everything lined up. So there certainly is a a high level outline that you've seen in the proposed draft of the criteria. But again, just like PREA for licensed residential and certified residential, we have policy documentation and process documentation behind that gives a lot more detail to potential providers of those programs to give them the ideas of, here's how I can develop these types of programs. You can also see that right now in the current criteria in Guide Note 11. So in Guide Note 11, we already have a good suggested outline. Again, guide notes are not criteria, are not enforceable, but they are good suggestions. So if you think about that, and you think about where CG PREA might go, we're going to align the focus the same way so that yes, there is a good outline. There's the expectations will be very clearly defined. So there's no question about what a potential provider has to do to develop a good CG PREA course. Valerie, anything you'd like to add? Because I know you're very focused.
No, that's great, and we're actually at the top of the hour, so that will bring us to a close. Yep. Thank you for attending and for your engagement in this process. We will certainly be looking at the other questions in the boxes, but be sure and get your comments in. Again, the comment deadline is July 27th. Our contact information is shown on the screen should you have any questions or need to reach us. Thank you again, and we look forward to receiving everyone's comments. Have a great day.